Hey, it's Bill with St. Pierre Woodworking. Check this out. This was 800-year-old wood. A couple years ago, I got a phone call from a customer who had actually had these logs on their property that were buried about 8 feet under the ground. I couldn't understand how they got there, and neither could he, because there was 200-year-old trees growing on top of them. So I went over to check out what was going on, and I could not believe these logs. I mean, it was like walking back in time. They were burned on the outside, so they had either gone through a forest fire, or some of the readings I did, the Indians would actually burn their trees so that they would die and then they would dry standing, and then they would cut them a year or two later. Either way, they were burned on the outside, they were axe cut, they were mostly solid. Some of them had some pretty good holes in them, but we were able to salvage some slabs out of them. So I was like so excited to get these loaded on the truck and get them back to the sawmill. Once we got them cut, I couldn't believe it. The wood was beautiful, but I couldn't rush it because the wood was so saturated. I had to let it air dry for 2 years. Normally, we just let wood air dry for maybe 2 or 3 months before we put it in the kiln. But I knew if I rushed it, I was going to ruin these slabs and they were going to twist up and break in the kiln. So I was patient, waited a few years, and we put them in the kiln and we're ready to build some tables. With all that wood, we were only able to get enough wood to build 3 or 4 tables. We did a few smaller tables with some of the stuff, but unfortunately, we just couldn't salvage all of it. So I had a few slabs left that I really wanted to build one more table out of. They were in really rough shape, but I figured if I could get them in the shop, start doing the epoxy pours, I could salvage these slabs. We put them on the wood whiz. We got them all flat, we got them smooth, and we were getting ready to bring them up into the shop. I wasn't quite sure what type of table I wanted to build, whether it was a conference table or a kitchen table, so I kind of went with both. I kind of went with you could do either or with it. Once I got them up into the shop and took a look at them, I had 2 slabs that were a book match set, basically a mirrored image, which means when those 2 slabs were cut off the log, it was like open them up like a book, and they were identical slabs. So those were the 2 I wanted to use for the top. I didn't really want to do a river pour down the center, so I was trying to figure out how to get these things close enough so I didn't have to use a lot of epoxy and have that river pour look, because I knew there was going to be a lot of epoxy in the table. So at the end of it all, I just decided to just go ahead and cut that live edge off and glue them up. And I'm really glad I did. So it was time to start the epoxy, and I was trying to sand everything down a little bit cleaner so the epoxy didn't stick to the slab and get all the crevices cleaned out. I didn't want to do a full epoxy pour. I wanted to be careful with these slabs. I wanted to kind of control the pours, do a little bit at a time, so I didn't jeopardize ruining these slabs, because there was no going to the store and buying more just like it. These are one-of-a-kind pieces of wood, and I really wanted to do something special with them without screwing them up. So all my pours were small, maybe, probably a quart per pour. And I kept doing it, just here and there and making sure that the slabs were stable. We did have our share of leaks. There was a lot of rough edges and stuff that was just really hard to keep the epoxy in, but we just kept working at it and got them all sealed up. We kept working on the top, and with all the holes on the top, it took forever to get this thing epoxied. I prefer filling the holes, the smaller holes, with epoxy. I know there's other ways to do it. I like using epoxy. I know it's going to stay in there and not pop out over time. So it was a process. It was about a week-long process just getting this thing all done. So we're getting closer. Now it's time to kind of pick out the base. I wasn't sure what type of base I wanted to do, but I wanted to keep it simple. I wanted to keep all the attention on the top. So we went ahead and took the last slab that we had, and we just started cutting the legs to size, got them all plain, all cleaned up, and then I could kind of start looking at the base on how I wanted to build it. In this case, I actually just did 2 straight little legs on the end, and I notched the stretcher, the piece that goes from leg to leg to hold the legs together, so that the legs would fit inside of the stretcher. Setting it up on top of the table just to kind of see what it would look like, making sure I was happy with it, and I went with it. I had this stretcher leaning up in the corner for about a year. It was a 4-inch chunk that I had cut off that was actually supposed to be a fireplace mantle, and I guess I just never got back to making it into a fireplace mantle. So it had the natural edge on one side, and it was just the most beautiful weathered aged edge. So I really wanted to highlight that in the table. We're having that edge up where you could see it. So getting this thing cut to size, there was one knot right in the middle of the stretcher that I really wanted to get centered on the table, as you can see here. And I just wanted to make sure that that knot was right in the middle. I had to waste a little bit of this on the ends to make sure that happened. But again, another thing I'm glad I did. Getting everything cleaned out, getting the mud from over the last couple 100 years out of the crevices, cutting off all the sharp edges. And I was getting ready to start putting this base together and getting everything notched out. In the meantime, it was time to get the top cut to length, flip it over, and start cleaning up the bottom where all the epoxy and the silicone was. This could have been a long process if I didn't have a wood whiz, but we were able to just bring it back down to the wood whiz and just kind of skim it and take all that right off there. Then it was time to start on the base. We notched out the stretcher to bring the two legs in so it had a good fit. I then took the base, or the foot piece, up to our other shop and put it on our CNC router where I carved out the dimensions of the legs so that they would drop down into that foot. It was starting to get a little bit too much wood, so I decided to paint those pieces black. The grain and a lot of the knots in the wood are black, and we're using a black epoxy, so I just thought it would be a great contrast. So after getting everything kind of dry fitted in there and making sure everything was the right height, it was time to go ahead and glue those pieces on and have the feet secured. We'll be putting a top plate on this as well to fasten the top to, which I also painted black. But with a little bit of glue and a couple 3-inch screws, the bottom piece was on and done. Everything was really starting to come together. The closer I got to the end of this build, the more anxious I was getting to get a finish on it. So a little bit more sanding, a little bit more epoxy in the holes, getting everything cleaned up. It was time to go to the spray booth. I'm putting a lacquer finish on this table, which is actually a bar top finish. It's a finish we've been using for years. It's a great finish if you were to set anything on it. It doesn't leave rings. If you were to spill water on it, it's not going to harm it. I really wanted to protect it. This is a one of a kind. So we went ahead, got everything sprayed, 3 coats of lacquer, sanded in between coats, and this thing just started to pop. The perfect mirrored image, these knots on the outside edge, it was just a beautiful top. It could be one of the nicest ones I've ever done. I was really impressed. We didn't have a buyer for this table. This was just something I wanted to build and put in our showroom. And I kept thinking back and forth, do I even want to sell it? And we have bills to pay. So the answer was yes, it needs to be sold. Getting it in the showroom, putting the top on it, couple weeks working on this thing, and I was amazed. It's just such a beautiful piece of work. The wood, the materials used, the grains in the wood, the story behind it. That tree started growing over 800 years ago, and it's just a one of a kind. So I am so pleased with the way this build came out, and I'm really excited about it. If you thought this was a cool project, check out this hanging slab we made.